In an ancient monastery in the mountains of Ethiopia, guarded by monks who uphold millennia-old traditions, lies a version of the Bible that many Christians have never seen, containing 81 books, nearly twice the size of the Bible we know. For centuries, these sacred scriptures remained isolated, preserving stories of fallen angels, giants, celestial visions, and apocalyptic prophecies that were systematically removed from Western versions. What do these ancient pages reveal that caused such discomfort to religious authorities? Why were texts like the Book of Enoch, even cited in the New Testament, erased from common Christian knowledge? What secrets about our spiritual origins and ultimate destiny are hidden in these manuscripts? Today, we will embark on a fascinating journey through the Ethiopian Bible, the oldest and most complete version of the Christian scriptures that has survived to this day. Get ready to uncover surprising revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew about biblical history, and why these truths were deliberately concealed for so long. The history of Ethiopian Christianity begins in a unique way, recorded in the very book of Acts of the Apostles. In chapter 8, we find the account of the encounter between Philip and a high-ranking Ethiopian official, the treasurer of Queen Candace, who was returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. This man was reading the book of the prophet Isaiah when Philip approached him, explained the scriptures, and revealed that the prophecies pointed to Jesus. The official accepted the faith and was baptized, possibly becoming the first African Christian mentioned in the scriptures. This initial seed did not immediately establish Christianity as the official religion in Ethiopia. It was only in the 4th century that the Christian faith formally consolidated as the religion of the Ethiopian kingdom through the remarkable mission of Frumentius, a young Christian from Tyre, who, along with his brother Odysseus, survived a shipwreck in the Red Sea. Brought to the royal court in Axum, they gained the king's trust. After the monarch's death, Frumentius became an advisor to the regent queen and tutor to the young prince Ezana, using his influence to favor Christian merchants and instruct Ethiopian youth in the faith. When Ezana reached the age to assume the throne, Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, where he reported to Patriarch Athanasius about the opportunities for evangelization in Ethiopia. Athanasius consecrated him as the first bishop of Ethiopia, establishing a lasting link between the Coptic Church of Egypt and the nascent Ethiopian Church. Frumentius's return resulted in the conversion of King Ezana around 330 AD, a fact evidenced by coins that initially displayed pagan symbols and later featured the Christian cross. With the conversion of the monarch, Christianity gradually became the dominant religion of the Aksumite kingdom, making Ethiopia one of the world's first Christian states, adopting Christianity even before the Roman Empire. The foundation of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, a term meaning unified, referring to the belief in the one nature of Christ, marked the beginning of a unique Christian tradition that would develop its own characteristics due to the kingdom's geographical isolation. The Ethiopian Biblical Canon gradually developed through a process of translation, selection, and preservation of sacred texts. Initially, the scriptures were primarily translated from Greek, the language of the Septuagint, into Ge'ez, the liturgical language of ancient Ethiopia. Some parts may have also been translated directly from Hebrew, indicating contact with Jewish communities from the Arabian Peninsula. The first translations into Ge'ez likely began in the 5th century, influenced by Syrian monks known as the Nine Saints, who fled the Byzantine Empire due to theological disputes. These monks established monasteries that became centers of translation and manuscript production. The Ethiopian Church developed its canon under strong influence from the Alexandrian and Coptic traditions. Alexandria was an important Christian intellectual center, whose library contained numerous religious manuscripts, including texts later considered apocryphal by Western traditions. Since the Ethiopian Church remained in communion with the Egyptian Coptic Church, and the Patriarch of Alexandria appointed the Metropolitan of Ethiopia until the 20th century. The Alexandrian influence on the Ethiopian canon was significant. Ethiopian monasteries played a crucial role in preserving sacred manuscripts. Places like Debre Damo, Debre Libanos, and the monasteries of Lalibela became centers for the production of richly illustrated manuscripts. Monastic scribes not only copied texts but also commented on and illustrated them, ensuring the survival of texts that disappeared in other parts of the Christian world. A distinctive feature of the Ethiopian canon is the inclusion of books such as Enoch and Jubilees, excluded from Western canons. The Book of Enoch was known and cited in the early centuries of Christianity, even in the New Testament, Epistle of Jude, but gradually fell out of use in the West, being preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian tradition. Similarly, the Book of Jubilees survived mainly through the Ethiopian tradition. The preservation of these texts demonstrates how Ethiopia's geographical isolation allowed the maintenance of literary traditions that vanished elsewhere. The Ethiopian Bible contains several books absent from Western canons, constituting a unique literary and theological treasure. Among these, the Book of Enoch stands out for its importance. This apocalyptic text is attributed to Enoch, a character briefly mentioned in Genesis as Noah's great-grandfather, who walked with God, and he was no more because God took him without experiencing death. The Book of Enoch presents an elaborate cosmology, describing the universe in multiple layers with detailed insights into angelic hierarchies. It contains accounts of the origin of evil in the world, attributing it to the rebellion of angels called the Watchers, who descended to earth, took human women as wives, and imparted forbidden knowledge such as metallurgy, cosmetics, and astrology. From this union, the Nephilim were born, giant beings who, according to the text, caused destruction in the pre-flood world. The book also contains prophetic visions, parables about the Son of Man, and a detailed astronomical treatise explaining the movements of celestial bodies. Another fundamental text is the Book of Jubilees, sometimes referred to as the Lesser Genesis. Written as a revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai, it reinterprets events from creation to the arrival of the Israelites at Sinai, dividing history into periods of 49 years, Jubilees. The text emphasizes adherence to the law and a solar calendar of 364 days, exploring themes such as the origin of evil through the figure of Mastema, Satan, the pre-existence of the law before its revelation to Moses, and the importance of patriarchal traditions. The Book of Maccabean, not to be confused with the Greek Maccabees, is another peculiarity of the Ethiopian canon. This text, in 3 parts, narrates stories of martyrs and heroes of faith with names similar to the characters of the Maccabees, but with completely different content. While the Greek Maccabees deal with the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire, the Maccabean books present narratives set in earlier periods, focusing on themes of resistance to idolatry. The Ethiopian Bible also includes texts about heavenly ascensions and apocalyptic visions, such as the Apocalypse of Ezra, the Ascension of Isaiah, and works attributed to Baruch, the scribe of Jeremiah. These texts share characteristics of early apocalypses, celestial journeys guided by angels, visions of the divine throne, revelations about the fate of souls, and prophecies about the end times. The Ascension of Isaiah, for instance, describes a vision in which the prophet traverses the 7 heavens and witnesses the descent of the Son of God. The Ethiopian biblical canon is the most extensive among all Christian traditions, comprising 81 books, nearly double the Protestant Old and New Testaments combined. This breadth reflects a more inclusive approach to the texts considered inspired, preserving works that other traditions relegated to apocryphal status. The organization of this vast canon follows a structure divided into 4 main sections: the Octateuch, 8 scrolls, comprises the Pentateuch plus Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. The second section, the Books of Kings, includes not only the 4 books of Kings and Chronicles from the Hebrew canon, but also texts like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. The third section contains the prophetic books, including the Book of Enoch. The fourth section, the Writings, includes poetic and wisdom texts such as Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. A distinctive feature is the inclusion of the Synodos, a collection of texts containing rules attributed to the apostles, decisions of early councils, and guidelines for the clergy. These documents, which in other traditions would be considered secondary canonical texts, are integrated into the scriptures in the Ethiopian Canon, demonstrating a broader view of divine revelation. This structure reflects a distinct theological vision. While Western traditions established rigid boundaries between canonical and non-canonical texts, the Ethiopian approach is more fluid, recognizing different degrees of authority among texts. This approach mirrors Ethiopian theology as a whole, which emphasizes continuity between Jewish and Christian traditions. Beyond its theological value, the Ethiopian Bible constitutes an invaluable cultural heritage, materialized in richly illustrated manuscripts representing one of the oldest traditions of Christian art. Ethiopian manuscripts are recognized for their distinctive artistic style, with vibrant colors, stylized figures, and geometric motifs inspired by Coptic and Byzantine art, but with unique characteristics. Each manuscript is a meticulously produced work of art, often taking years to complete. Monastic scribes and artists developed particular techniques for preparing parchment, formulating colorful inks, and crafting durable bindings. The illuminations of Ethiopian manuscripts typically depict biblical scenes, saints, and the cross, the supreme symbol of Christian faith in the Ethiopian tradition. The monasteries of Lalibela and Aksum stand out as historical centers for preserving this textual heritage. Lalibela, with its rock-hewn churches from the 13th century, houses important manuscript collections. Aksum, the ancient capital of the Aksumite kingdom and, according to tradition, the resting place of the Ark of the Covenant, maintains manuscripts of great antiquity. In Ethiopian liturgy, the scriptures are objects of veneration. Gospel manuscripts are treated with reverence, covered with precious fabrics, and carried in processions during important celebrations. Before the reading of scriptures, the book is incensed and kissed, showing respect for the sacred text as a manifestation of the divine presence. Complementing the written texts, the Ethiopian oral tradition keeps the interpretation of scriptures alive through commentaries, homilies, and chants passed down through generations. The Deteras, clergy specialized in liturgical music and biblical interpretation, preserve ancient melodies and traditional commentaries that accompany the reading of sacred texts. The unique development of Ethiopian Christianity and the preservation of rare sacred texts are largely due to geographic isolation. Situated on the Abyssinian plateau, surrounded by rugged mountains and deserts, Christian Ethiopia developed in isolation from the main currents that shaped Mediterranean and European Christianity. This isolation intensified after the Islamic expansion in the 7th century, which resulted in Muslim control of the Red Sea coast, further isolating the Christian Ethiopian kingdom. As an island kingdom surrounded by non-Christian territories, Ethiopia developed a strong identity, closely tied to its national identity. A remarkable feature of Ethiopian Christianity is the preservation of Jewish practices abandoned by other Christian traditions. The Ethiopian Church maintains Sabbath observance in addition to Sunday, practices male circumcision, follows dietary restrictions similar to kosher laws, and keeps the separation between pure and impure areas in temples. This preservation of Jewish elements has generated theories about possible influences from Jewish communities established in the region before Christianity. Central to Ethiopian religious identity is the legend of the Ark of the Covenant in Aksum. According to the tradition preserved in the Kebra Nagast, Glory of Kings, King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba had a son named Menelik, who, when visiting Jerusalem, brought the Ark with him, transferring the center of the divine covenant to Ethiopia. To this day, the Ethiopian Church claims that the true Ark is kept in the Chapel of the Ark in Aksum, reinforcing Ethiopia's self-understanding as the new Israel. The geographical and cultural isolation contributed decisively to the preservation of texts lost in other Christian traditions. While Western Christianity underwent theological transformations, the Ethiopian Church, although formally accepting some conciliar decisions, remained partially on the margins of these discussions due to communication difficulties, allowing earlier literary traditions to remain alive. Among all the texts preserved solely in the Ethiopian tradition, the Book of Enoch is perhaps the most fascinating and controversial. Originally written in Aramaic or Hebrew between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, it survived entirely, only in the Ge'ez version, although Aramaic fragments found among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm its antiquity. The most controversial aspect of the Book of Enoch is its narrative about the Watchers, angels who, led by Semjaza and Azazel, descended to earth, attracted by the beauty of the daughters of men. According to the text, "And it came to pass, when the children of men had multiplied, that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of the heaven, saw and lusted after them. And they took wives for themselves, and each chose for himself one." This narrative expands on the brief mention in Genesis 6:1-4 about the sons of God who joined the daughters of men. The book describes how these fallen angels taught humans forbidden knowledge. Azazel taught the making of weapons and cosmetics, Barak-Ijal, astrology. Others taught enchantments and the knowledge of plants. This transfer of knowledge is presented as a transgression that corrupted humanity, and wickedness increased. They fornicated and erred, and were corrupted in all their ways. Enoch presents a detailed angelic hierarchy, naming not only the fallen angels, but also faithful archangels like Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael, assigning specific functions to each. This elaborate angelology influenced early Christianity, but was later considered overly speculative. The book also recounts Enoch's cosmic journeys through the heavens, where he observes the secrets of creation, places of punishment for rebellious beings, and astronomical phenomena. These descriptions of a multi-layered cosmology conflicted with the simplified cosmology that prevailed in medieval Christianity. Particularly problematic were the messianic prophecies in the parables of Enoch, chapters 37-71, which describe a celestial figure called the Son of Man, presented as a pre-existent being who will judge the world. Although interpreted by early Christians as prophecies about Jesus, the Christology implied in these visions differed from the later formulations of the ecumenical councils. In addition to the Book of Enoch, the Ethiopian Bible contains other apocalyptic texts considered problematic by religious authorities. These writings are characterized by detailed revelations about the end times, descriptions of divine judgment, and cosmic visions that transcend ordinary human history. The descriptions of the end times in these texts are extraordinarily detailed, presenting specific chronologies, precursor signs, and descriptions of the final cataclysms. For example, the Apocalypse of Ezra contains a vision where the seer asks about the remaining time, receiving in response a sequence of signs. When you see that the time is approaching, there will be earthquakes, tumults among the peoples, schemes of the nations, inconsistency of leaders, and confusion among princes. Such descriptions fueled apocalyptic speculations that ecclesiastical authorities sought to moderate. Particularly provocative were the visions of divine judgment on corrupt rulers. Texts such as the Apocalypse of Isaiah and parts of Enoch contain denunciations against unjust kings, promising them severe punishment. For example, Enoch declares, "Woe unto you, mighty, who with power oppress the righteous, for the day of your destruction shall come, and you shall be handed over into the hands of the righteous." In periods when religious power aligned with secular authorities, these passages could be interpreted as subversive. The Ethiopian apocalyptic texts also contain narratives about celestial entities not mentioned in other biblical texts. Besides the fallen angels, they describe beings like Leviathan and Behemoth as cosmic monsters, angels who control weather phenomena, and hierarchies of spiritual beings. Such descriptions diverged from the more restricted angelology developed in medieval theology. Another controversial aspect was the political allegories encoded in symbolic language. Apocalypses like that of Ezra use animal imagery to represent empires and rulers, offering interpretations of history that could be read as criticisms of contemporary powers. During times of imperial domination, such passages could encourage resistance to established authority. Finally, these texts contain astronomical and calendrical predictions that contradicted established systems. The Book of Jubilees, for example, insists on observing a solar calendar of 364 days, condemning the lunar solar calendar. There are people who observe the moon, but this is not the ordained calendar. You must observe the calendar according to the sun. Such prescriptions contradicted both the rabbinic Jewish calendar and the dating systems developed by the Western Church. As Christianity became institutionalized and defined its doctrines through ecumenical councils, many Ethiopian texts came into tension with official theology, contributing to their exclusion from Western canons. The councils of the 4th and 5th centuries, particularly Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, established precise definitions of the nature of Christ and the Trinity. However, texts like Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah presented Christologies, developed before these definitions, using language that could seem ambiguous in light of later formulations. A significant example is the issue of descriptions of Christ's nature. The Ascension of Isaiah contains a vision in which the sun descends through the 7 heavens, progressively taking on the form of the inhabitants of each level until assuming human form. This description, while it could anticipate the doctrine of the Incarnation, uses language that suggests an apparent transformation, approaching Docetism, a heresy that claimed Christ's body was merely an appearance. The Ethiopian texts also contain alternative accounts of creation and the flood that diverge from Genesis. The Book of Jubilees presents an expanded account of creation, including the creation of angels on the first day, and stating that the Garden of Eden was created on the 3rd day, but Adam only entered it after the first Sabbath. As literal exegesis developed, such variations became problematic for authorities concerned with the unity of the sacred text. Interpretations of human fall and original sin also differed. While Augustinian theology emphasized the hereditary transmission of original sin, texts like Enoch attributed human corruption to the influence of fallen angels, suggesting that humanity was a victim of corrupted celestial influences, thereby reducing human responsibility, a central concept in Western theology. Regarding views on salvation and the afterlife, Ethiopian texts often presented challenging conceptions. Some apocalypses, like 4 Ezra, contained dialogues questioning divine justice in condemning most of humanity, suggesting possibilities of universal redemption or limited punishments, ideas that contradicted the doctrine of eternal damnation consolidated in medieval theology. The encounter between the Ethiopian biblical tradition and European powers, particularly from the 16th century onwards, revealed political and religious tensions surrounding Ethiopian texts and practices. In 1557, Jesuit missionaries arrived in Ethiopia at the invitation of Emperor Claudius, initiating attempts to convert the country to Roman obedience. Jesuit Pedro Paez gained influence at court, achieving the conversion of Emperor Susenyos to Catholicism in 1622, marking the beginning of a policy of correction of the Ethiopian canon and practices. The missionaries identified irregularities in the Ethiopian Church, including circumcision, Sabbath observance, dietary restrictions, and the use of apocryphal texts. Particularly problematic was the Ethiopian Christology, which followed the Miaphysite position, affirming the single nature of Christ, in contrast to the Chalcedonian definition of the two natures united without confusion. These reforms encountered strong popular and clerical resistance, culminating in revolts that forced Susenyos to restore traditional Christianity before his death in 1632. His successor Fasilides expelled the Jesuits and reaffirmed Ethiopian religious independence, demonstrating a determination to preserve its traditions against external pressures. During the colonial period, attempts to correct the Ethiopian canon were renewed. Protestant and Catholic missionaries, armed with new translations, questioned the authenticity of Ethiopian texts, labeling them as pseudepigraphs or apocrypha, undermining their authority. Resistance to biblical standardization was part of the struggle to preserve cultural identity and national independence. Ethiopia maintained its sovereignty during the colonial period, except for the Italian occupation from 1936-1941, facilitating the preservation of its religious traditions. A sensitive aspect was the political use of apocalyptic texts. Works like the Kebra Nagast and Apocalypses were interpreted to legitimize dynasties, justify resistance against invaders, or support national hopes. During the Italian occupation, interpretations circulated identifying the invaders with demonic forces destined for defeat. Such subversive readings worried colonial authorities. Western authorities often labeled Ethiopian texts as heretical. Scholar August Dillman, who published the first modern translation of Enoch in 1853, noted that the Church rightly banned such books because of their many erroneous and heretical assertions. A controversial aspect of Ethiopian texts, particularly Enoch, is the detailed treatment given to the Nephilim, hybrid beings born of the union between fallen angels and human women. This theme, only briefly mentioned in Genesis 6:1-4, is considerably expanded, generating problematic narratives for Western religious authorities. Enoch describes the Nephilim as giants with a height of 300 cubits, approximately 135 meters, beings with an insatiable appetite who turned against mankind to devour them and began to sin against all birds, wild animals, reptiles, and fish. This narrative of cosmic violence goes beyond the reference in Genesis, presenting an apocalyptic vision of the antediluvian world dominated by monsters. The text explains that when the giants died in the flood, their spirits remained as evil spirits, becoming the origin of demons. The spirits of the giants will destroy without incurring judgment, and the spirits of the giants will afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, fight, and cause destruction on the earth. This narrative posed significant theological challenges. It suggested that angels were capable of sexual union with humans, leading many theologians to reinterpret Genesis 6 as referring not to literal angels, but to pious descendants of Seth. who married the corrupted descendants of Cain. Additionally, the idea that demons were spirits of giants contradicted later demonology, which identified demons as fallen angels. These stories were gradually considered mythological and removed from other canons. Later Christian theology, influenced by Greek thought, emphasized the distinction between spiritual and material beings, making the idea of sexual union between angels and humans problematic. Furthermore, the rationalized cosmology of medieval Christianity had little room for fantastic giants and cosmic monsters. The theological implications of these genealogies were unsettling. Enoch's narrative suggested that human evil originated partly from the corruption introduced by angelic beings, diminishing human responsibility and complicating the issue of divine justice. Interestingly, these narratives find parallels in other ancient traditions. Stories of divine beings uniting with human women appear in Mesopotamian and Greek mythologies. The story of the Nephilim may represent the Hebrew response to these myths, reinterpreting them within a monotheistic framework where such unions are seen as transgressions. Beyond controversial narratives, the Ethiopian texts contain descriptions of ritual practices that diverged from Western customs, contributing to the perception of the Ethiopian tradition as deviant. The texts present elaborate purification and exorcism rituals. The Testament of Solomon, for example, contains detailed instructions for identifying and exorcising different types of demons, including their names, characteristics, and methods to subdue them. These practical manuals raised suspicions among authorities concerned with magical practices. Another distinctive aspect is the calendrical ceremonies that differed from the Roman liturgical calendar. The Book of Jubilees insists on a solar calendar of 364 days, with feasts that must not be delayed nor brought forward. This emphasis contradicted the system for calculating Easter in Western Christianity, generating practical tensions between communities that celebrated the same feasts on different dates. Also notable are the dietary prescriptions that maintain Jewish elements. Texts like Jubilees preserve prohibitions against certain foods, especially pork. These restrictions, abandoned by Western Christianity since apostolic times, remained alive in the Ethiopian tradition. Similarly, male circumcision, practiced in Christian Ethiopia as a cultural custom, was viewed with estrangement by Western missionaries. The Ethiopian texts describe methods of prayer and meditation considered unorthodox. Writings such as the Ascension of Isaiah contain instructions for ecstatic visions and spiritual journeys, practices reminiscent of later Jewish mystical techniques. Such contemplative practices contrasted with the Western emphasis on structured prayer. There is an intricate relationship between Ethiopian liturgy and the forbidden texts. Ritual elements such as drums in worship, liturgical dance, the use of ceremonial umbrellas during processions, and purification practices find justification in texts like Enoch and Jubilees. For example, the division of sacred space in Ethiopian churches into areas of increasing holiness, culminating in the Makdas, Holy of Holies, where only ordained priests may enter, reflects prescriptions found in these texts, reminiscent of the structure of the Temple of Jerusalem. These ritual peculiarities, grounded in the exclusive texts of the Ethiopian Canon, contributed to the distancing between Ethiopian and Western Christian traditions. When European missionaries encountered these practices, they often interpreted them as corruptions of original Christian purity, failing to recognize that they represented an ancient and continuous tradition. The effort to correct these practices was inseparable from the attempt to purify the Ethiopian canon, eliminating the texts that justified such ritual differences. This repertoire of distinct ritual practices demonstrates how the texts considered forbidden or apocryphal by Western traditions, were not mere literary curiosities for the Ethiopian Church, but living foundations of its spiritual and cultural identity. The persistence of these practices into contemporary times testifies to the vitality and resilience of the Ethiopian tradition, which maintained its distinctive characteristics despite centuries of pressure to conform to Western models. For centuries, Ethiopian sacred texts remained virtually unknown to the Western world, kept in remote monasteries in the mountains of Ethiopia. This situation changed drastically when European explorers began to conduct expeditions to Ethiopia in the 18th and 19th centuries. James Bruce, a Scottish explorer who traveled to Ethiopia between 1768 and 1773, was a central figure in this process. He returned to Europe with copies of several Ethiopian manuscripts, including the complete Book of Enoch. Initially, Bruce's accounts were met with skepticism, but the manuscripts eventually caught the attention of scholars like Richard Lawrence, who in 1821 published the first complete English translation of the Book of Enoch. The impact of the discovery of the Book of Enoch on biblical scholarship was profound. This text, briefly cited in the Epistle of Jude, offered a comprehensive view of Jewish apocalyptic beliefs from the Second Temple period. Scholars were astonished to discover that many ideas previously thought to be uniquely Christian had antecedents in ancient Jewish literature. The Ethiopian texts fundamentally challenged Western understanding of the formation of the Bible. The existence of a broader Ethiopian canon demonstrated that different Christian communities had taken distinct paths in defining sacred scriptures. This raised important questions. Who had the authority to decide which texts were inspired? Why were some texts excluded while others remained? The study of these manuscripts contributed significantly to the development of modern textual criticism. As scholars compared the Ethiopian versions with fragments in other languages, they refined methods to reconstruct the history of ancient texts, transforming our understanding of how sacred texts were transmitted through time and cultures. One of the most important moments in the history of biblical studies occurred in 1947 with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Among these ancient scrolls, archaeologists found fragments of the Book of Enoch and Jubilees in their original languages, confirming the authenticity of the texts preserved in Ethiopia for millennia. The connection between the Qumran manuscripts and the Ethiopian texts provided extraordinary archaeological validation. Texts that many Western scholars had dismissed as late now had physical evidence of their antiquity. The Enoch fragments, found at Qumran, dated to the 2nd century BCE, demonstrating that this book existed long before previously assumed. Various archaeological excavations confirmed places and events mentioned in the Ethiopian texts. For example, geographical descriptions in the Book of Enoch about locations in northern Israel and the Mount Hermon area were corroborated by archaeological findings, adding historical credibility to these texts. The Ethiopian texts also provided valuable context for understanding ancient religious artifacts. Amulets and magical inscriptions from the Hellenistic and Roman periods often mention the names of angels and demons that appear in texts like Enoch. Researchers can now recognize references to Azazel, Semjaza, and other beings when they appear in archaeological objects. Comparative studies of these texts revealed a surprising diversity within ancient Judaism. We now know that multiple interpretations of Hebrew religious tradition existed. The Ethiopian texts preserve evidence of apocalyptic and mystical currents that were marginalized in later rabbinic tradition. This new understanding led to a reinterpretation of various archaeological sites. For example, the ritual purification. Facilities found at Qumran can now be better understood in light of the ritual purity concerns expressed in texts like Jubilees. The study of the Ethiopian texts prompted a profound academic re-evaluation of the process of forming the biblical canon. The evidence suggests a complex process influenced by theological, political, and cultural factors, not merely by divine inspiration, as traditionally believed. The Ethiopian texts revealed a more diverse Christianity in its origins. The fact that different Christian communities maintained different collections of sacred texts demonstrates that there was no uniform, original Christianity, but rather a variety of interpretations and traditions. The canonization process is increasingly understood as a political as well as a religious phenomenon. Decisions about which texts to include or exclude were influenced by theological debates, power struggles, and imperial interests. Texts like Enoch, with their visions of judgment against corrupt rulers, were uncomfortable for a Christianity increasingly aligned with imperial power. An important trend in modern biblical studies is to consider apocryphal texts as historically valuable, regardless of their canonical status. The Ethiopian texts occupy a central place in this re-evaluation, demonstrating that the distinction between canonical and non-canonical varies according to tradition. The Ethiopian texts increasingly appear in comparative studies of religions. Scholars studying the common roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam find in these texts evidence of shared traditions. For example, stories about fallen angels similar to those in Enoch appear in Islamic traditions. The historical and theological value of marginalized traditions is receiving greater academic recognition today. The Ethiopian tradition, which maintained its independence despite external pressures, represents one of these voices that now enriches our understanding of the history of Christianity. The Ethiopian texts, particularly the Book of Enoch, have had a significant impact on contemporary popular culture. Numerous fiction writers have incorporated elements of these texts into their works. The image of the Watchers, fallen angels, mingling with humans and sharing forbidden knowledge has inspired narratives in novels, comics, and films. More controversial has been the use of the Book of Enoch in theories about ancient astronauts. Authors like Erich von Däniken interpreted the descriptions of the Watchers as evidence of extraterrestrial contact in antiquity, suggesting that the angels were beings from another planet who shared advanced technology. Although these theories are rejected by the academic community, they have generated popular fascination. The influence of the Ethiopian Bible also extends to contemporary music, art, and literature. Visual artists have created works inspired by Enoch's cosmic visions. Musicians, especially in genres like reggae and metal, have incorporated themes from these texts into their compositions. Poets and writers draw on these sources to explore themes of revelation and visionary experiences. These ancient texts have also inspired contemporary spiritual movements. New Age groups have adopted practices and cosmologies based on interpretations of Ethiopian texts. Some esoteric movements study Enoch's angelology as a guide for meditative practices, adapting these ancient visions to contemporary sensibilities. There is a persistent popular fascination with the forbidden secrets contained in these texts. Numerous videos, websites, and publications explore the hidden truths supposedly censored by religious authorities. This fascination has kept interest in the Ethiopian tradition alive far beyond academic or religious circles. The texts preserved in the Ethiopian tradition hold special significance for the Rastafarian movement, which developed in Jamaica in the 1930s. Rastafarians, who consider Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia from 1930 to 1974, a messianic figure, have a deep interest in Ethiopian texts such as the Kebra Nagast and the apocalyptic parts of Enoch. In African and African American communities, Ethiopian texts have provided important resources to counter biblical interpretations that historically justified racism. The discovery that one of the oldest Christian traditions in the world is African contradicts Eurocentric narratives about Christianity. African American churches have incorporated elements of these texts into their theology. Ecumenical dialogue with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has gained greater importance in recent decades. After centuries of viewing Ethiopian practices as deviations, Western churches are now increasingly recognizing the legitimacy of this ancient tradition. Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox leaders have participated in conversations with the Ethiopian Church, acknowledging its profound spiritual heritage. This openness reflects a growing appreciation for diversity within Christian traditions. The previous model, which privileged European forms of Christianity as normative, has given way to a more genuine recognition of Christianity as a global phenomenon with multiple legitimate cultural expressions. For many marginalized communities, the forbidden texts preserved in Ethiopia offer valuable resources for finding their own theological voice. Enoch's visions of cosmic justice, where oppressors face divine judgment, provide powerful language and symbols for communities seeking to articulate their struggle for justice in religious terms. The history of Ethiopian texts and their exclusion from Western canons raises important questions about who has the authority to define sacred scriptures. For centuries, Western ecclesiastical authorities determined which texts should be considered inspired, marginalizing divergent traditions. The persistence of the Ethiopian tradition challenges the idea of a single, correct canon. Scholars and theologians have pointed out parallels between the historical exclusion of religious texts and other forms of cultural censorship. The suppression of alternative voices within religious traditions reflects broader dynamics of power and control. In this sense, recovering texts like Enoch is not merely an academic exercise, but an act of historical justice. In recent decades, there has been a growing trend to recover silenced voices in religious history. This movement connects with broader efforts to decolonize knowledge. The Ethiopian texts, preserved for centuries in an independent African Christian tradition, represent knowledge that survived outside the channels controlled by European colonial powers. The Ethiopian Bible plays an increasingly important role in interfaith dialogue. Its preservation of elements, showing connections between Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, provides conceptual bridges for conversations between these religions. The evidence of diversity within these traditions, since their origins, weakens narratives of exclusivist religious purity. These texts contribute to a more complex understanding of human spirituality. The Ethiopian texts present a multidimensional, spiritual world filled with symbols, visions, and complex narratives. By expanding our access to these ancient expressions of spiritual quest, they enrich our understanding of the multiple ways humans have tried to make sense of their existence and connect with the transcendent. The contemporary relevance of these texts demonstrates that the religious past is not merely dead history, but a living resource that continues to inspire and challenge the human spiritual quest. The Ethiopian Bible, preserved through centuries of isolation and cultural resistance, now emerges as an important voice in global conversations about faith, justice, and religious diversity. If you enjoyed this journey through time and are intrigued by these revelations about texts that few know, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that sheds light on lesser explored aspects of the scriptures. Share this video with friends and family who appreciate discovering the deep roots of the Christian faith and the stories that have been forgotten along the way. Remember, knowledge is light, and by sharing this video, you help illuminate others with these ancient wisdoms that have stood the test of time. See you in the next video, where we will continue our journey through the biblical stories that changed the world.